programming is kind of a fun course. So before we get too far, one thing I want to remind you, because I've been deluged with advisees here this last couple of days, if you haven't enrolled, please do so as quickly as possible. I have a couple of students who in various models want to graduate because they have somehow gotten off track with fall and spring courses. It's going to be very difficult for them to do that, and in some cases they're going to add another semester or so to their schedule. So be sure you get a hold of your advisor and get enrolled if you're not. And I know everybody in here that I'm looking at physically has enrolled. Nope, none of you guys have really guilty looks. That's good. So generally, I know it's hard to sometimes remember to do those things, but it's important and it lets us know so we can add additional sections and different things. So one thing I will throw out there, I noticed that Arts and Sciences has added additional sections of several classes, including statistics, which I know a lot of people were trying to get into. So make sure you look and double check, because we do want to get you graduated on time so you can make those big checks when you eventually get that real job and you're working 40 hours a week. So this really leads into some of the stuff we're going to talk about in cybersecurity. So some of you have already taken cyber because we don't require one before the other. Some of you are hopefully going to take it in the spring. But one of the things we really look at when we look at that last little piece is things like physical security controls. And we spend a lot more time talking about them. How do I secure those things? And so I have a lot of stories we talk about in cybersecurity about places where literally you can walk in the door and you're staring at their server. How do I deal with that? How do I enforce physical security? And so it can be as simple as things like making sure that there's a key. I have run into places where every employee had the same key to the building, same key to the security closet, if there was even a closet. How do I make sure some of these pieces are secure? Obviously, we have better ideas now. So a lot of you are used to these proximity cards or the swipe cards, so you can actually see who goes in and out. So it can track who goes in and out of a building. If you're used to going to hotels, if you've been to a recent hotel, you don't actually even have to swipe the card. You just get up close. Those are those proximity keys. And that's one of the things that we look at. But they're a little expensive. So the last time I looked at ones for an installation, and in fact, we looked at them here for this building when they remodeled this building a couple years ago, and it was still about $1,500 per door to put that in. And so you'll notice we still have physical keys in our building. So how do I define who should be in there? Part of that also is policy. Who gets in? Do we let everybody into our server closets? And so think about those videos we've looked at in other courses and in this one about like Google's data center. How do I make sure that the right people are in there and the wrong people are out? Do I have a vendor policy, which becomes very important? Because a lot of times we contract out, and do we just want everybody willy-nilly to go in there? And if you have additional requirements, so I do some consulting with some law enforcement agencies, and to get into those law enforcement agencies, I've had to do additional certificates that say I know what I can and can't reveal, just because that may have a phone line that runs through a data closet. So make sure you're aware of what your insurance company, your regulatory agencies, who can get into these rooms that you have data in. So, for example, insurance companies are very tight about who can get access to a lot of that data. Health insurance or health things, very similar. So this is just a very quick illustration, but usually we have some kind of a badge reader. In addition to that badge reader, one of the things we almost always do, so there is those proximity cards. So what's always amusing is you see places that use those and they put them about 5 inches above hip level, and you'll see guys wearing them in their back, and they're doing the little hop to go get into the room. So at least if nothing else, there's that amusement of watching people get into the room. So what other things can we do? We can put biometrics in, because somebody can steal your card, and that actually does happen. Or you can clone it in some theories. So now we have biometrics. And the biometrics are getting more and more sophisticated every day. So some of my stories from a couple years ago are now hopefully not possible. So a couple of years ago, I actually got into a drug dispensing machine with a gummy bear talcum powder, and a CD. And I cloned somebody's fingerprint and was able to use that to get into a drug dispensary machine in a hospital. We did it as an experiment to see if we could do that. So this is the machine that actually allows the nursing staff, the doctors, to get into all the good drugs. And that's where they hide them in these little locked compartments. And we were able to get in there fairly easily. And so we set up some of the nursing staff. So we got some of their fingerprints. We cloned them. And we actually were able to get in. Well, now the biometrics have gotten much, much better. So now there are things like pulse detection to make sure that there really is a pulse. They've gotten more granular in the level of detail. And we've gotten to the point now where, what does the latest iPhone do for login? The iPhone X, if you have one. Anybody bought one yet? It's facial recognition. Now, several other phones, Samsung's had phones that have facial recognition, and in some cases you could fool them with a picture of somebody. And it does present some issues. How do I make sure we get in there? So, we have a lot of other ones that they talk about millimeter wave scanners. We're probably not going to see that, but there's other scanners in different types. There's iris scanners, and there's all different kinds of biometrics that we'll use. Some of them will actually look at the facial bone structure. They're not just looking at your outside face. There's palm scanners, all different kinds of technologies we can use for physical controls. One of the other things, and so this is not politically correct because we call them man traps and we don't call them person traps, right? So apparently only men will do bad things and get stuck in there. If you've been to a high-end jewelry store, you get inside of one door, you get buzzed in, and then there's a second door in. So you're in what's called a man trap. 2 doors in an entryway. Well, we do the same with a lot of our technology. And it's one of the areas that actually here at the college, we fail for PCI compliance, and that's part of the reason we offsite our credit card processing, because we can't meet PCI because we don't have a man trap on our data closet here. Our data closet on this campus, one door opens it and you're in. Just an interesting little piece. So that idea of able to trap somebody inside of there, you'll see quite a bit. So fingerprint scanner. So here is an advanced imaging scanner. I'm not really sure what the little square on the knee is for. I'm really kind of scared about that one. So if you've been to the airport, you've had this kind of scan done before, we're probably not going to use this, quite frankly, into our data closets yet. But there's even some more obtrusive ones than that. You can now get an RFID tag that's just like when you microchip a pet. It's about the size of a grain of rice, and you can inject it in their neck or other spot. You can actually get one. And there are some companies in the U.S. using this where they ask you to get a microchip on your arm or hand to get into secure facilities. Now, there's some ethics issues there, and we talk about those, but there are other ways we can get into those resources. So, what other things might we do in there? So, one of the most common things we do now, although in our cybersecurity class we talk a lot about why cameras can be really bad right now, but we put cameras. Cameras are cheap. You can go to Home Depot and for $400 or $500 buy a 16-camera system and a drive and a whole thing, plug it in, view your house from anywhere in the world. Now, unfortunately, because those systems are fairly loose in terms of security, maybe everybody can view your world also. So we'll talk about that from both good and bad, but a lot of places have went to closed circuit cameras or whatever you want to call them. IP cameras, same idea, just a little different technology, how it pushes that image. So you will find that a lot of very large cities. So if you go to London, you are going to be on camera almost the entire time you are walking through there. So you will see this. If you go to a casino, if you've ever been in a casino, one of the fun things I got to do was actually do some work inside of a casino, and I got to see inside their security protocols. And it wasn't a big casino, but they had a room about the size of this one you're in here now, about 20 by 30, and it was literally covered with monitors, and like 40-inch monitors, and they would show 8 pictures, I believe it was, on each monitor. And there were literally hundreds of security cameras in that small casino. And this is one of the areas where very few people get to go inside a casino. So it was kind of interesting and neat to see. But they literally have cameras everywhere except the bathrooms. And I wouldn't even put that against them. But they are monitoring not only employees, but they are customers, but employees also. So there are cameras everywhere in there, and they monitor them very, very carefully. So the same with our IT area. You probably want to see who goes in there and who goes out. So it is after the fact, but it might well show what happened. And even the presence of cameras can be a deterrent. If I walk in and I was going to steal that necklace at the jewelry store, but I see a camera in my face, I might put it back and not actually walk out with it in my pocket. Well, that painted a picture of me as a thief, but that's not the... So, where do we go with them? How do we put them? So, again, it's a really good idea to double check those, make sure those are in there, and then look at the installation. Are you actually recording? Again, it's that idea of making sure things are correct. And then think like a thief. So the other thing, once we come up with all these ideas, think like a thief. Put yourself in that model of how would you get around there? So maybe you could have the Mission Impossible theme music playing, and you could try to figure out, well, I know we have cameras, but you know what? I know that the data on them is so data heavy, we only store 7 days worth of data. If I can get by with something and it was 7 days ago, they have no record of it any longer. So make sure codes don't get passed out to other people. So one of the things that we see a lot of times is, in addition to the biometrics, there's usually a keypad in case that doesn't work. So make sure that everybody isn't using those key codes. So in the telecom sector, one of the weird things I worked on was outside plant, and we have, essentially you can go about 60 miles on fiber optic before you have to regenerate it, what's called a regen station. And so from Omaha to Kansas City, there's 2 regen stations. So I won't say what national carrier this was, but they carry a lot of data. And what we discovered is all the facilities had the same security code to get into them. Interesting. And in a fit of sophomoric humor, does anybody want to guess what the 4-digit combination was to those keys? It was not 1, 2, 3, 4. They did not do that. No. Nope, it was numbers. 4 numbers. Exactly. 6969. Every one of these facilities around the country that we went to, we discovered that they were all keyed alike. So, we had to go figure out, all right, maybe this is not a good thing. Now, you're also on camera when you go in there. We hope, and all these things work. But just the fact that you could get in there that easily, and because those facilities were everywhere and they carry a huge amount of data, could you cause a disruption if you had 3 or 4 of your buddies all sneak in little ninja masks and come in and do that? Yeah. So, you go in there with a hatchet, you could disrupt the national communication system. So, one of the places they transferred data, for example, was up to Offutt Air Force Base. You think if you cut off one of the major lines of communication into Offutt Air Force Base, life might be interesting? So, one of the other things we need to worry about then, do we ever trade out computers and you get a new one? So in a business, we generally put them on a cycle of 3 to 5 years. At the end of that, what do we do with that computer? How do we deal with it? So you say, well, I'm going to reinstall Windows, or I'm going to just, hand it to somebody. Is that a good plan? So what do we do with all that information that's on that drive, and is it still accessible? So as a college, as a state agency, we actually take the hard drives out and we shred them. We actually run them through a giant shredder and pulverize them physically. The book talks about using what's called a degausser, which is really a strong magnet that will also do that. But quite frankly, as cheap as hard drives are, I'm not going to take that chance. So again, I will tell you a story about a casino, just to reinforce that. So I worked with an organization. We were working to do computers for people who didn't have them a few years ago. Before computers got to the point where, they were $200 on Black Friday specials, some people couldn't afford a machine. We did this. I got a couple machines donated by a casino which is in a 100-mile radius of here. We'll narrow it down a little bit. So that was a very nice gesture. But before we did anything else, we thought, well, let's just fire up a couple of these. And they came up and they still had an operating system on them. And I went, oh, interesting. And then I noticed that several of them had accounting software still on them. Interesting. I opened the accounting software, which, by the way, there was no passwords on any of this, so we'd yell about that in cybersecurity. So we go into a little more detail in other courses. I'm looking at their accounting software for a couple of months ago. It was up to date to that point of all their revenue, all their expenses, where they sent checks. Yikes. So you get rid of a machine, you want to make sure that data is gone. Easiest way, we shred that hard drive, we physically destroy it in most cases, and that makes it harder to get rid of. Again, a hard drive now, you can get one for under $100. It doesn't make a lot of sense to do that. There are programs you can buy also, and we'll talk about those, that in theory will wipe a drive. But again, as cheap as it is, if I have sensitive data on there, I'm going to eliminate it. So, what else can happen? Disasters. Something's going to happen. A security breach, a natural disaster. And so setting in place those policies, those plans of what we need to do ahead of time means we can recover. We don't lose our business. There are businesses that when they lost data, they're gone. So we call that DR, disaster recovery. So it's not just backup. We need to think about what can happen. So data breaches, data corruption, whether intentional or non-intentional. So you leave your employer because you're mad, and you go in and wipe out every computer drive or every drive on the server. Does it happen? Yeah. Does it happen accidentally when an employee does something? Yeah. Yep, we're going to do a backup, and we're going to do an update, and holy crap, there's no data left on our server. It can happen. We have a tornado. We have a flood, depending on where we're at. We have a power outage. We have a lightning strike. How do we deal with that? And so we just barely touch on it. We do a lot more in the cybersecurity looking at the idea of disaster recovery. So the reality is we need to figure out a way to recover and figure out what's going to happen. So everything from computer systems to telephones, because a lot of them are important, to paper-based files. What are we going to do with them? How do we have copies of those? So for example, a lot of hospitals. In fact, if you've been in a hospital recently, everything's done electronic. They come in with an iPad or something, and they're checking you in and out. What happens if that hospital has an extended power outage? Do they still have paper-based forms that they can manage your care with? And that's part of that disaster-based recovery model. If worse comes to worse and we don't have power at the hospital, the backup generator doesn't work, we have a paper-based trail that we can use to make sure you're getting adequate care. So we need to come up with plans. And it varies from business to business, how much you're willing to spend on it. But the reality is if you don't have a plan and you have a natural disaster, you're going to have a big issue. Think about Lincoln Public Schools a couple of years ago. Is anybody in here from Lincoln? Aha. What happened to the Lincoln Public Schools office a couple of years ago? It did. An employee got mad and lit the entire building on fire. All of the school records for every K through 12 student in Lincoln, 55 different schools comprise that school system up there. All of their records gone. But because they had some disaster recovery plans, they were able to recover in a couple weeks all that data. Imagine if you'd went through high school, the superintendent's office burned to the ground, and suddenly they said, well, I don't know what classes you took. You may just have to take over your entire education. It'll be like Billy Madison. Come on, I had to throw in a Billy Madison reference. But how do we deal with it? And so these things do happen. We do have employees that will burn a building down. So we need to figure out then where our data is at, what we're going to back it up. Not only that, but how are we going to back it up safely, securely, and so that other people can't get to it. So we need a plan. A disaster recovery plan. So as a personal plan, you need to figure out a way. I have all this stuff, my papers. What happens? You're working on all these projects and papers for finals. What happens if one of those disappears? What do you do? Do you have plans? So in a lot of cases, we outsource. So a company will outsource an external entity to come in and give them some ideas how to plan. They'll hire a consultant, so they'll detail some plans, and then they'll work with the company internal. And one of those things it does is it identifies what things are important and what things aren't. So the chairs at the desk, probably not important. But the data stored on some of those computers, maybe we really need to have that data migrated to a server, and that server having a copy somewhere in the world. And so that's one of the plans we look at, and that idea of having different sites. So this ranges from cheap to expensive. So a cold site might mean that you have a building available you can use, and there's probably some old computers sitting there, but nothing's really set up, nothing's configured, nothing's connected until you have a disaster. So that's the cheapest model. All the way to the most expensive model. In other words, we completely replicate that server room. We completely replicate all the data. So my PSC, you guys use it. Kearney uses it. UNL uses it. The Med Center uses it. UNO uses it. All stored in one data center. So do you think that a cold site's appropriate for a backup for that? Or do you think there's a hot site would be better? A hot site. And in fact, that's what is happening. So primarily the data exists at UNL and is processed there. But there is an identical site at the Med Center in Omaha. So the hope is that a tornado would not go all the way from UNL all the way to the Med Center. And probably that isn't. So generally we look at these as 15 to 20 miles difference in sites or completely different terrain and geography. And then somewhere in the middle is that idea of a warm site. So again, it's a continuum of cost. How much stuff is in each one, which one you want to look at. So that's part of that disaster recovery. How do I recover if the world goes bad? And I will tell you that it's hard money to fight for. Because until something goes wrong. So until Lincoln Public Schools got burned down, I bet the IT administrator there had to fight to get off-site backups. And had to fight to say, hey, we need this recovery equipment. But suddenly when that building burns down, holy cow, maybe we should have spent this money. So it's one of those, it doesn't seem like a great reuse of resources, and in a lot of times in budget cuts, that's one of those things that we'll cut. It's like, well, we don't really need a recovery site or a warm site or a hot site. Let's cut that out. Well, then suddenly if you're Amazon and your data center collapses or burns or something happens to it, and you can't make sales on Christmas, yikes. So the other piece in there on our policies is this idea of forensics. And so we're getting a lot of forensics information right now about a horrible case in Lincoln. Does everybody hear about the young lady that went missing? So part of the reason they were able to find where her body was, unfortunately, is due to that idea of digital forensics. So I guess it's fortunate they figured out part of that, but the reality is, as a company, we need to probably have an idea of our own internal forensics policy. So what happens if somebody breaks in? How do we audit our systems to make sure what they got out of there, if that was their intent? Weather issues, all of those, we need to probably go in. What if we log into our server and we notice that somebody else has been in there remotely? So forensics is becoming an important part of corporate. It's certainly an important part of law enforcement, how we deal with those episodes. And again, we talk a lot more about that in our cybersecurity. But if I have an employee, and I think right now there are probably 100 different individuals right now that have been fired for various sexual assault, sexual conduct issues, right? We look around and every time I flip on the TV, it's some other celebrity being fired. Well, it's not just celebrities. Do we have employees that make inappropriate jokes and emails that we need to fire? Yeah. I have seen some of those and been brought in as a consultant on some of those. So the latest one of them I had that I got dragged into or asked to look at, this individual kept sending out anti-Semitic jokes, including ones about ovens and holidays. Really, really bad. So how do I present that for, not necessarily because they're not going to a criminal trial, but if I fire somebody, do they often sue you? Even in a state like Nebraska, where in theory we're a right-to-work state, they will sue. So how do I safeguard that information and say, all right, we fired you and we fired you with just cause. Here's the reasons why. And so sometimes this takes a while. And if that person especially lies into any one of the protected classes. So in this particular case, that individual was an older gentleman who falls into a protected class. And so their first assertion was, you're firing me because I'm old. No, we're firing you because of this. And we had that evidence preserved so it could go into, if he decided to file a lawsuit, that you could do that. Companies get sued. Business organizations get sued. Political organizations get sued. Colleges get sued. All the time. And so being able to deal with that information and know what you need to do. So if I fire somebody, maybe one of those things is, yes, we cut off their access to email, but do we also keep a copy of their email for a certain length of time? And depending on the company and what the legal experts say, that may be the last 30 days, that may be the last 2 years, that may be every piece of email you can possibly ever collect. And so we need to be aware of what kind of things we need. So we fire an employee, we immediately reassign their computer to somebody else, right? So one of the cases that I found very interesting with that idea of not preserving evidence is a company in Massachusetts fired an employee, whatever reason, and so he had a laptop. It was reassigned to another individual. Within a couple of months, that laptop was tracked down by the FBI, and it was serving up child pornography. Every time it plugged into a network, it's serving up child pornography. The individual then was arrested and spent 18 months in prison waiting trial until what they figured out was it was actually the previous employee had added stuff to that laptop. So think about that when you go out there. What happens to somebody when they're arrested for something like child pornography? Are you ever going to have a clean name again? Your name is really going to be mud, isn't it? So how do we deal with that? As a corporation, then, we need some plans on how do we monitor, how do we deal with it, how do we deal with things including employees, how do we transfer equipment down. I worked with a company a few years ago, in fact I was on the board of this particular company many years ago, that we did like most companies do. The engineering staff had the fastest machines, and when they got done it moved down to the secretarial pool. But we made a mistake. What we did was we did not uninstall AutoCAD and several other pieces of drafting software. Well, we had a disgruntled employee who we fired for various reasons. We're pretty sure who it was. They filed a report with the BSA, the Software Alliance, and you'll see their ad saying, hey, report your employer, make $100,000. And they came in with a court order and audited our computer systems. It cost well over $100,000 in penalties before we were done with that incident. And in fact, we bought licenses for AutoCAD then for everything, including computers that were sitting on a shelf that would never run the AutoCAD at that point, because we were ready to throw them away, but we ended up spending a huge amount of money to get updated, to get compliant with this. And the reality was, it was our fault. We hadn't uninstalled it. Now, I will say this, the secretaries we had were certainly not playing with AutoCAD in their free time. That program never turned on, but it didn't matter. So even as a corporation, those tools like that Spiceworks to go in and look at that are a really great idea. We can see what software is installed where. But when we have an issue, how do we monitor? How do we document? So we need policies on these. And in general, a bigger corporation is going to have a lot of that stuff already done. Smaller corporation, it's going to be harder to deal with. And you may, at that point, part of your disaster recovery plan is you may have a company that you only call in for these kinds of issues. Because if I call in a specialist company for some of this, it's going to be expensive, but it might well be enough to save our bacon in that case. So there's also response teams. Make sure you read the book about that, because there is a question on both the final and this week's question. So this last chapter is kind of a mismatch, a wrap up of a lot of different pieces all thrown together. So do be aware, all of this does happen. Disasters happen. How do I fire an employee, save their evidence? So, if you haven't signed up for cybersecurity, here's my sales pitch. Take a look at it as an optional course. Now, I think the online section may be full, but sometimes those have some churn. The on-campus one, I think, has a few seats left in it. So take a look at that. Think about how, as a company now, I can deal with all of those kinds of issues. So now for the meat of the day. You guys all want to know about the final, right? So originally the final was only going to be open for about 48 hours. I was persuaded. I went ahead and actually opened it up right now. So your final is open. It is worth 90 points. You have a take-home submission piece, and some of you have already done that, worth 10 points. So there's some questions in there, including some tutorials. So you have both of those pieces in there. So there are, if I counted right, there are 6 essay questions that are on the final. They are all things we have talked about. So I'm pretty sure there is one as a hint about service level agreements. So make sure you can tell me what a service level agreement is. There are no subnetting questions on there. It is pretty straightforward. 90 points. And in fact, I believe there's even a couple of extra credit points you can earn on that final. So it is due before Wednesday the 13th at midnight. So make sure you don't forget to take that. The other thing that is due Wednesday night, midnight, are those lab connections. And so I have some interesting suggestions already. So make sure you post in week 16. There's a discussion board. One of the things that is a really great suggestion is if they would tie this together. And the original intent was lab connections would work directly inside a Blackboard. So far, Cengage hasn't made that happen. So I can't put a direct link in. It doesn't quite work. So if the newest version of Lab Connections isn't significantly better, I will probably, for the future students, substitute out something different because I'm not sure it fulfills quite the need. There are some fun and interesting pieces in it, but I think there's some other ways we can get around the need and not pad Cengage's pockets quite as much as what it is. Now the interesting part, Cengage, you would think makes a ton of money, right? If you actually pull up their financials, they don't somehow, which is really scary. So I think that's part of the reason some of these products haven't gotten deployed as well as what they'd like to. So make sure you look at that. Offer suggestions. I have a fairly thick skin. If you want to say bad things about me, I'm fine with that. I want to know better ways we can get this kind of information to you because I think you're going to all experience things like disasters in your life at some point, and it's probably going to be at a company. It may be as simple as the power going off, a fire. It may be a natural disaster. Some of you may move to Florida and end up getting hit by a hurricane. Who knows? Maybe a giant snowstorm if you're the opposite end and you end up in St. Paul, North Dakota or somewhere. But take a look at this. This is, I think, some interesting information about disaster recovery. And again, we use these things. These things show up. When we get Netflix, it shows up. We can look at that. We can see that kind of traffic. So how we're going to monitor, how we're going to keep these costs in consideration. The other thing I will leave you with is, as a thought, you probably should investigate net neutrality. Read about it. Figure out what it really pertains to. Does it affect me? Because I think for most of us as consumers of content, it certainly might. And so the models without net neutrality are interesting. And from a business standpoint, I'm a little torn. But the reality is, for most of us that we consume a huge amount of multimedia content, social media, it certainly could have some changes. You could have to buy, for example, a social media package as an addition to your data package on your internet. You might have to buy a streaming media package as an addition. Or they could, in theory, just block. So if you had Time Warner Cable, Netflix is a competitor, they could just block Netflix from appearing on your internet connection. So be aware of that. Think about that. Remember to turn in both the take-home portion of the final, and finish lab connections. That is a big chunk of your grade in there, that lab connections. And that should be 300 points. It's pretty easy, a third of your grade. So fairly easy. All right, any questions? Thoughts? Comments? Throwing tomatoes? All right, thank you guys for a great semester.